In 1959, a motivational psychologist and professor at Georgia State University published a book that he had spent years developing through his work with business executives, salespeople, and students who came to him, not because they lacked intelligence or talent or opportunity, but because something was quietly sabotaging their results in ways they couldn't quite name. The book sold modestly at first. Then it found readers, the way genuinely useful books eventually do, through the hands of people who had tried it and found that it worked, passing it to people who needed it. Over the decades, it sold more than 4 million copies. It has never gone out of print. It is still, 65 years after its first publication, being recommended by successful people across virtually every field as one of the books that most directly changed how they approached their own potential. The book is called The Magic of Thinking Big. The author is David J. Schwartz, and its central argument, stated as plainly as possible, is this: the size of your success is determined not primarily by your intelligence, your talent, your education, your background, or your resources, but by the size of your thinking. And the size of your thinking is not fixed. It is a learnable, improvable, deliberate practice that produces results in direct proportion to how consistently and how boldly it is applied. In this video, I want to give you the full, complete, honest treatment of what this book contains, why it has endured for more than 6 decades, what its ideas look like in practice, where it is genuinely limited or deserves critical examination, and what the practical payoff of applying its principles actually looks like over time. This is not a shallow overview. It's a real engagement with a book that has changed how a very large number of real people understood what was available to them. Let's begin with Schwartz himself, because the book is grounded in observation rather than theory, and understanding where the observations came from makes the ideas more credible. Schwartz earned his doctorate in educational psychology and spent his professional life not primarily in academic research, but in close, sustained contact with working people. Executives, salespeople, managers, entrepreneurs, and students who were trying to build something and finding themselves consistently producing results smaller than their apparent capabilities would suggest. Through years of this contact, he became increasingly convinced that the primary determinant of what people actually achieved was not the objective quality of their intelligence or skills, but the scope of what they allowed themselves to believe was possible. He observed, repeatedly and across a wide range of contexts, that people with genuinely mediocre talents but expansive thinking consistently outperformed people with genuine talent but small thinking, and he spent years trying to understand why and what could be done about it. The result is a book that is relentlessly practical. It makes no philosophical pretensions, references no academic literature, and asks no deep questions about consciousness or meaning. It is simply a systematic treatment of the specific mental habits that separate large thinkers from small thinkers, presented with the directness of a man who watched this distinction play out in real lives over decades, and drew his conclusions from what he actually saw. Let's begin with what might be the book's single most important observation, and the one that is most consistently underestimated by people encountering these ideas for the first time. Schwartz argues that the great majority of people who consider themselves to be failing or underperforming relative to their potential are not actually failing because of what they lack. They are failing because of a habit of self-limitation so familiar and so embedded that they have stopped recognizing it as a choice. The name he gives to this habit is excusitis, a word he coins to describe the disease of excuse-making that prevents most people from ever seriously attempting what they actually want. The 4 most common forms of excusitis, the ones he encountered most repeatedly in his professional experience, are health excusitis. I can't do this because of my health or my physical limitations. Intelligence excusitis. I can't do this because I'm not smart enough. Age excusitis. I can't do this because I'm too old or too young. and luck excusitis. The successful people got there because of luck or connections I don't have, not because of anything I could replicate. What makes excusitis so difficult to recognize in yourself is that the excuses are almost never entirely false. Someone with excusitis around health does often have genuine health challenges. Someone with excusitis around intelligence does often have real gaps in their education or knowledge. Someone with excusitis around age is not wrong that they are older or younger than the conventionally ideal age for what they want to do. The problem is not that the excuse is invented. The problem is that the excuse is being used as a reason not to try, and that this use systematically overstates the degree to which the limitation actually prevents success. Schwartz's evidence for this is the same kind of observational evidence that runs through the entire book. Real people, with real versions of each of these supposed limitations, who succeeded anyway, not because the limitation disappeared, but because they refused to allow it to function as a reason not to try. People with genuinely poor health who built successful enterprises. People with limited formal education who became industry leaders. People who began late who overtook people who began at the conventional time. People with no apparent advantages of luck or connection who found and created their own opportunities. The practical implication of the excusitis diagnosis is uncomfortable because it suggests that the primary obstacle to most people's success is not what is happening to them, but what they are telling themselves about what is happening to them. And addressing this requires not finding new resources or better circumstances, but changing a mental habit that has been reinforced over a long time and that feels, from the inside, like simple realism. The book's approach to excusitis is direct. Name the excuse you're using, examine it honestly against the evidence of people who had the same limitation and succeeded, and then refuse to give it the power you have been giving it. Not by pretending the limitation doesn't exist, but by stopping the automatic conversion of a real limitation into an absolute barrier. The next major idea in the book, and the one that most directly explains the title, is the relationship between the size of your thinking and the size of your results. Schwartz is not making a mystical or motivational claim here. He is making an observation about how thinking actually functions as a causal mechanism in the production of results. Small thinking in his framework operates by constraining what you attempt. If you believe at a deep habitual level that a certain level of achievement is roughly what someone like you can expect, you will unconsciously calibrate your effort, your risk tolerance, your persistence, and your openness to opportunity around that expectation. You will attempt less. You will persist less. You will invest less. You will notice fewer opportunities because your attention is not trained on the range of possibility your small thinking has excluded. And because you attempt less, persist less, invest less, and notice fewer opportunities, you will achieve less. The small thinking and the small achievement reinforce each other in a loop that feels, from the inside, like simply being realistic about your limitations. Large thinking works the inverse way. If you have developed the habit of believing that a substantially larger outcome is genuinely available to you, you will calibrate your effort, risk tolerance, persistence, and openness to opportunity around that larger expectation. You will attempt more. You will persist longer. You will invest more. You will notice more opportunities because your attention is trained on a larger range of possibility. And because you attempt more, persist longer, invest more, and notice more opportunities, you will achieve more. The large thinking and the large achievement reinforce each other in a loop that feels, from the inside, like being appropriately ambitious about your real potential. The crucial insight here is that neither the small thinking loop nor the large thinking loop is driven primarily by actual differences in intelligence, talent, or circumstance. Both are driven primarily by the habitual scope of what the person allows themselves to believe is genuinely possible, and that scope is not fixed. It is a mental habit, and mental habits can be changed. Schwartz devotes considerable attention to what he calls the belief in bigness, the fundamental prerequisite for everything else the book teaches. The belief in bigness is not a vague aspiration or a wishful thought. It is a specific, practiced, sustained mental posture toward your own potential. The genuine, lived conviction that you are capable of substantially more than you have yet produced, and that the path between where you are and that larger outcome is findable, learnable, and worth the cost of finding it. He offers several practical methods for building this belief, and they are worth examining in some detail because they are more specific than the phrase, "think big," suggests. The first method is what he calls selective environment management, deliberately and systematically arranging the people, conversations, and information sources that constitute your daily mental environment so that they feed the belief in bigness rather than starving it. Most people's environments contain a significant proportion of what Schwartz calls small thinkers, people whose habitual assumption is that things are hard, that success is for other people, that risk is foolish, and limitation is wisdom. Extended daily contact with this orientation, regardless of the quality of the advice that comes with it, gradually erodes the belief in larger possibility. The practical move is not to eliminate all small thinkers from your life, which is often neither possible nor desirable, but to actively and deliberately seek out the company and the stories of people who think and operate at the level you're trying to reach, using them as ongoing evidence that what you want is actually achievable rather than merely theoretical. The second method is what he calls vocabulary management, being deliberate and consistent about the specific words and phrases you use to describe yourself, your situation, and your possibilities. Schwartz observed that small thinkers consistently use language that closes possibility. "I can't. I don't know how. It's too risky. That's not the kind of thing people like me do." Large thinkers, by contrast, use language that opens possibility. "I'll find a way. I can learn what I need to know. What's the opportunity here? What would have to be true for this to work?" The specific words matter not primarily because of their persuasive effect on others, though they do have such an effect, but because of their ongoing influence on the speaker's own thinking. The language we use to describe a situation both reflects and shapes what we believe about it, and consistently using possibility-oriented language gradually builds the neural habit of possibility-oriented thinking. The third method is deliberately acting the size of your thinking. Schwartz makes the counterintuitive but practically important observation that action doesn't simply follow from belief. It also precedes and produces belief. If you consistently act as if you are operating at the level you want to reach, carrying yourself with the confidence, the professionalism, the quality of attention to your work that someone operating at that level would bring, the acting gradually produces the believing rather than waiting for the believing to produce the acting. This is a practical mechanism for building larger belief in people who don't yet have it and can't simply decide to feel it on demand. Now let's move to what Schwartz has to say about the mechanics of building confidence, because confidence, in his framework, is not a personality trait that some people have and others lack. It is a learnable skill with specific, identifiable practices that build it. The primary enemy of confidence, Schwartz argues, is not failure. It is the specific kind of thinking that converts ordinary difficulty and ordinary setback into evidence of permanent inadequacy. Small thinkers interpret difficulty as confirmation that they weren't good enough to begin with. Large thinkers interpret the same difficulty as information about what needs to be learned or adjusted, and as evidence that they are in the interesting, productive space at the edge of their current competence. The difficulty is identical. The interpretation is different, and the interpretation determines whether the experience produces shame and withdrawal or learning and advancement. Schwartz offers several practices for building confidence that are practical rather than motivational. The first is what he calls the deposit and withdrawal account for self-confidence, recognizing that every action you take either deposits or withdraws from your confidence account. Taking an action you were afraid to take, even a small one, is a deposit. Avoiding an action because of fear is a withdrawal. Doing quality work is a deposit. Cutting corners is a withdrawal. Speaking up when you have something to contribute is a deposit. Staying silent from fear of being wrong is a withdrawal. Over time, these individual transactions produce either a growing confidence account or a depleting one, and the total in the account determines how available confidence feels in any given challenging situation. The second confidence practice is what he calls making yourself important, treating yourself and presenting yourself in ways consistent with genuine self-respect rather than in ways that signal deference and unimportance. Schwartz observed that small thinkers consistently signal their own smallness through presentation, through posture, through the quality of their clothes, the tidiness of their workspace, the care they take with their appearance, and the way they introduce and represent themselves. These signals are not vanity. They are feedback that the person is sending themselves and others about what they deserve and what they are capable of, and they shape both self-perception and the perceptions of people who make decisions about who to trust, promote, invest in, and collaborate with. The third confidence practice is avoiding the comparisons that shrink you. One of the most reliable sources of small thinking is the habit of comparing yourself to people who have more, who have been at it longer, who appear to have advantages you lack, and using those comparisons as evidence that you are behind or inadequate. Schwartz's prescription is not to be unaware of people who are more advanced than you, but to use their existence as evidence of possibility rather than as a measuring stick of your current inadequacy. The successful person ahead of you on the path is evidence that the path is real, not evidence that you can't travel it. Let's now go deeper into the book's treatment of human relations, because this is an area Schwartz devotes significant attention to, and where his observations are unusually practical. The book argues that virtually all career and professional advancement, beyond a certain basic level of competence, is mediated through relationships with other people, and that the quality of those relationships is determined primarily not by cleverness or social sophistication, but by one consistent, learnable orientation, making the people around you feel genuinely important. This is not a manipulation tactic, and Schwartz is careful to distinguish the genuine practice from its imitation. The genuine practice is making a consistent, deliberate effort to see the people you interact with as genuinely significant, to treat their concerns as genuinely mattering, to give them your real attention rather than performing attention while your thoughts are elsewhere, and to communicate, through your behavior rather than just your words, that they are people worth your respect and engagement. The imitation, which most people can immediately sense even when they can't name what feels off, is performing attentiveness in order to get something, without the underlying genuine regard that authentic attentiveness reflects. The difference is not primarily visible in what you say or even in how you say it. It is visible in the thousand tiny details of whether your presence with another person is genuine or theatrical, and most people register this distinction, even when they don't have the vocabulary to articulate it. Schwartz's practical tools for this orientation include several that are simple, specific, and highly actionable. The first is calling people by name consistently and correctly, which signals that you have made the effort to notice and remember who this specific person is, as opposed to treating them as interchangeable with everyone in their category. The second is asking about and genuinely attending to what the other person cares about, letting their interests and concerns shape the conversation rather than only the interests and concerns you brought into the room. The third is listening to people in a way that makes them feel genuinely heard, which is different from simply not talking while they speak. The fourth is expressing genuine appreciation specifically rather than generically, noting the particular thing someone did and why it mattered rather than offering a vague thank you that could apply to anyone. The book also devotes significant attention to the management of what Schwartz calls human friction, the small, daily disappointments, frustrations, and irritations that come with working closely with other people. Large thinkers, he observes, have developed the habit of giving people the benefit of the doubt when their behavior is ambiguous, of interpreting difficulty as the result of circumstances rather than malicious intent, and of letting minor irritations pass without allowing them to accumulate into resentments that gradually make productive working relationships harder to maintain. Small thinkers, by contrast, are quick to assume negative intent, quick to catalog slights, and quick to allow minor friction to grow into lasting grievance. Schwartz doesn't argue that this habit is a moral failing. He argues that it is a practical one, that the person who consistently gives others the benefit of the doubt builds more functional, more sustainable, more productive relationships than the person who doesn't, not because the world is always kind, but because the relationship quality produced by generous interpretation is consistently more useful than the relationship quality produced by suspicious interpretation. Now let's talk about goal setting and action, because the book has a great deal to say about this that goes beyond the generic goal-setting advice that most people have already heard. Schwartz's first and most important point about goals is that most people set them far too small. Not small in relation to some cosmic standard of ambition, but small in relation to what the person is genuinely capable of. The small thinking described throughout the book manifests most clearly in goals. People set goals at the level they're confident they can reach rather than at the level that would require and develop everything they actually have. He observes that goals set at the level of confident expectation tend to produce comfortable, moderate results. Goals set at the level of genuine stretch, goals that are not certain, and that require the person to operate at the edge of their current capacity, tend to produce both larger results, and through the process of pursuing them, a genuine expansion of the capacity itself. This is a finding well supported by the psychology of goal setting, particularly the work of researchers like Edwin Locke and Gary Latham, which consistently shows that challenging goals produce better performance than easy goals, not because the stretch goal is more likely to be met, but because it changes the level of effort, attention, and persistence the person brings to the pursuit. Schwartz's second major point about action is about overcoming what he calls action paralysis, the tendency to delay beginning anything significant until all conditions are favorable, all information is available, and all risk has been mitigated to a level that feels comfortable. He is not arguing for recklessness. He is arguing that waiting for perfect conditions before acting virtually guarantees permanent inaction, because conditions of genuine certainty and safety don't actually precede significant undertakings. They are produced, gradually and partially, by the taking of imperfect action in imperfect conditions. His prescription is to act on your best current judgment with the best currently available information, accepting that the action will be imperfect, that some adjustments will be required, and that the quality of information and judgment available after acting is consistently better than the quality available before. The person who acts imperfectly and learns and adjusts consistently outperforms the person who waits for certainty that never arrives. The third point about action is the importance of following through on small commitments before making large ones, because the habit of follow-through is built through small exercises of it before it's available for large ones. Schwartz observes that the people he encountered who consistently achieved large things were uniformly people who followed through on small commitments with the same completeness they brought to important ones, and that this habit of follow-through was not originally a product of the large ambition they were trying to achieve, but a prerequisite for it that they had developed through thousands of small instances of doing what they said they would do when they said they would do it. Let me now spend some time on a dimension of the book that gets less attention in most summaries, but that I think is among its most valuable contributions: the book's treatment of the environment of success and failure. Schwartz argues, based on observation rather than theory, that human beings are far more shaped by their daily environments than they typically acknowledge. The conversations you have every day, the people you spend the most time with, the information you habitually consume, the physical spaces you occupy, all of these continuously influence your thinking in ways that are mostly invisible precisely because they are continuous and familiar. He uses a specific image to make this point. If you want to know what kind of fish you'll become, look at the water you're swimming in. And the practical implication is that if the water you're swimming in, the daily environment of your working and social life, is full of small thinking, limited expectations, habitual complaint, and resigned acceptance of mediocre outcomes, then becoming a large thinker in that environment is an uphill struggle that most people eventually lose, not because they lack the capacity, but because they're swimming against a current that never stops. The practical prescription is not to suddenly abandon your existing life and relationships, which is neither possible for most people nor necessarily desirable. It is to be conscious of the direction of influence that your environment is exerting, and to begin deliberately adding elements to it that support rather than undermine the larger thinking you're trying to develop. Seeking out a single mentor, joining a professional group that operates at the level you want to reach, reading consistently in the area you want to develop, beginning one relationship with someone who has built what you want to build. Each of these is a concrete action that shifts the water you're swimming in, however slightly, in a more supportive direction. Let's now look at what the book says about the relationship between thinking big in specific life domains: career, finances, and personal fulfillment. In career contexts, the book's primary observation is that advancement beyond a certain basic level of competence is almost entirely a function of visibility and relationship quality rather than technical skill. Most people in most organizations have sufficient technical skill for roles considerably larger than the ones they occupy. What separates the people who advance from the people who don't is primarily whether the right people know about them and their work, whether they are perceived as people who can handle larger challenges, and whether they have built the kinds of relationships that cause decision makers to think of them when opportunities arise. Small thinkers in organizational contexts tend to do good work and hope it will be noticed. Large thinkers do good work and take deliberate, thoughtful action to ensure that it is noticed and that the relationship between their contribution and positive outcomes is visible to the people who matter. This is not manipulation or self-promotion in a distasteful sense. It is a recognition that in complex organizations, the connection between individual contribution and visible outcome is rarely automatic, and that waiting for excellence to be independently discovered is a far less reliable strategy than building relationships and visibility alongside the excellence. In financial contexts, the book's primary observation is that financial outcomes are disproportionately shaped by the financial thinking you bring to your situation rather than by the raw financial circumstances. Two people with identical incomes, Identical starting points and identical constraints can make dramatically different financial progress depending on whether their financial thinking is oriented toward scarcity or toward building, toward protecting what they have or toward deploying it to produce more, toward waiting for a better situation before making financial decisions or toward making the best decisions available in the current imperfect situation. Schwartz is not offering specific investment advice or a financial planning framework. He is making the prior, more fundamental argument that the quality of financial thinking precedes and determines the quality of financial decisions, and that financial thinking, like all thinking, can be deliberately developed rather than simply accepted as whatever it currently happens to be. In the domain of personal fulfillment, the book makes what is perhaps its most personally challenging argument, that the most common source of unhappiness and dissatisfaction in people who are otherwise functionally successful is the gap between what they are actually doing and what they genuinely want to be doing, and that this gap is almost always maintained by small thinking rather than by genuine impossibility. Most people's deepest dissatisfactions are not with the circumstances of their lives, but with the distance between the life they're living and the life they know. At some level, they could be living if they allowed themselves to think big enough and act boldly enough. The practical prescription is not to pretend this gap doesn't exist or to make peace with it as realistic acceptance of limitation, but to take it seriously as information about a direction worth pursuing and to begin, with whatever small first step is currently available, moving in that direction. Let me now address the fair criticisms of this book, because they deserve acknowledgement alongside the genuine value. The first criticism is historical. The book was written in 1959, and some of its content reflects the social assumptions of that era in ways that a contemporary reader will find limited. The business examples feature an almost exclusively male and American cast of characters. The social context assumed by many of its examples is one of post-war American prosperity and opportunity that does not reflect the starting conditions of many people today. These are real limitations, and a fair-minded reading of the book acknowledges them rather than pretending they don't exist. The second criticism is structural. The book's relentless focus on individual thinking and individual action understates the role of structural factors in producing outcomes. A person experiencing racial discrimination, significant economic disadvantage, or other genuine systemic barriers faces challenges that better thinking will help navigate but cannot simply overcome through attitude alone. The book does not claim that thinking big solves structural problems, but its framing, which consistently attributes differential outcomes to differential thinking rather than differential circumstances, can be read as implicitly dismissive of obstacles that are genuinely not reducible to mental habits. A complete picture of what determines outcomes requires acknowledging both the individual thinking factors the book covers and the structural factors it largely ignores. The third criticism is psychological. The book's emphasis on projecting confidence and managing appearance, on dressing well, carrying yourself with authority, and cultivating the impression of someone operating at the level you want to reach, has been criticized as placing too much emphasis on performance rather than authentic development. The concern is that people who focus primarily on appearing successful, rather than on developing the genuine substance of success, are building a facade rather than a foundation, and that this approach is ultimately more fragile and less satisfying than one grounded in actual competence and genuine self-respect. These criticisms don't negate the book's value, but they do appropriately calibrate where its insights apply most cleanly and where they require supplementation. What remains genuinely valuable, after holding these criticisms honestly, is substantial. The core observation about the relationship between the scope of your thinking and the scope of your results is not just motivational. It is empirically grounded in what Schwartz actually observed across a career of working with real people in real situations, and it is consistent with what psychology has subsequently confirmed about the role of self-efficacy and goal setting in determining performance. The specific practices he recommends for building the belief in bigness, managing your environment, developing your vocabulary, acting the size you want to reach, are practical and actionable in ways that abstract motivational advice is not. The excusitis diagnosis, however uncomfortable, has genuine explanatory power for a pattern most honest people can recognize in themselves and the people around them. The conversion of real but partial limitations into absolute barriers that prevent the attempt entirely. The specific practices for treating excusitis are similarly practical: nomming the excuse, examining it against the evidence, and refusing to give it the power you have been giving it. And the human relations content, particularly the emphasis on making people feel genuinely important and the practical tools for doing so, is as applicable today as it was in 1959, because the underlying human need to be seen, valued, and treated as significant has not changed, and the capacity for genuine attentiveness and specific appreciation to build the kinds of relationships that support larger achievement has not diminished. Let's run through some frequently asked questions before the final close. Question 1. Does this book work for people starting from very difficult circumstances, not just people who already have some advantages? The honest answer is that the book's prescriptions help in any circumstances, but that they help more in some circumstances than others. The thinking big principles are most directly applicable in situations where the primary constraint is the scope of what the person is attempting rather than genuine structural barriers to advancement. For people facing severe economic hardship, discrimination, lack of basic resources, or other systemic challenges, the Thinking Big framework addresses a real dimension of the situation, but does not address all of it, and supplementing it with practical knowledge about navigating the specific systemic challenges you face is necessary. Question 2. Isn't some of this just positive thinking dressed up in business language? The book's relationship to positive thinking is complicated. It rejects the most magical versions of positive thinking that suggest attitude alone determines outcomes. It endorses a more practical version, that the habitual orientation of your thinking significantly influences your action, and that action is the actual mechanism through which outcomes are produced. This is a more defensible and more empirically grounded claim than pure positive thinking, though it can be simplified into pure positive thinking by readers who want that version. Question 3. What about imposter syndrome and the genuine anxiety that comes with attempting larger things? The book doesn't use the term imposter syndrome, which wasn't in common use in 1959, but it addresses the phenomenon directly under the framework of confidence and excusitis. Its prescription is essentially that the anxiety is real, that it doesn't go away by waiting for it to go away, and that the reliable method for addressing it is to continue acting at the level you want to reach rather than waiting to feel confident before acting. This is consistent with what contemporary psychology says about managing anxiety in performance contexts. Question 4. Is the advice to project confidence and dress for the role you want rather than the role you have manipulative or inauthentic? Schwartz's position, which I think is defensible, is that presentation is a form of communication, and that communicating the level at which you want to be taken seriously is not manipulation but appropriate representation of your genuine ambitions and capabilities. The distinction between this and manipulation lies in whether the substance behind the presentation is real. If you are genuinely developing the capabilities required for the level you're projecting, the projection is honest. If you are projecting without developing, the projection is ultimately unsustainable, and the distinction between ambition and deception becomes important. Let's close with what I believe is the most practically useful takeaway from this book, the one that applies most cleanly across the widest range of people and circumstances. The book's deepest insight is not about success or ambition in an abstract sense. It is about the daily, habitual relationship between your thinking and your reality, the way that what you consistently allow yourself to believe about what is possible for you shapes, with remarkable fidelity, what you consistently attempt, and what you consistently attempt shapes what you consistently achieve. Most people, most of the time, are living inside a mental box whose walls they built themselves, whose construction they have mostly forgotten, and whose constraints they have long since stopped questioning, because the box has become so familiar that it no longer looks like a box. It looks like the world. The book's invitation is not to pretend the box isn't real, or to paper its walls with positive affirmations, or to will your way to success through the sheer force of wanting it enough. The invitation is to examine the box, to look honestly at where the walls are, to ask whether the walls you've placed on what is genuinely possible for you reflect actual limits or the accumulated weight of unconsidered assumptions, and to begin, cautiously and practically and with genuine willingness to take risk and do the work, testing the walls by pushing against them. Most people who test the walls discover that the walls were further out than they thought, not infinitely far out, not magically absent, but further out than the habitual comfort of the box had allowed them to explore. That discovery, made practically and repeatedly through the kind of deliberate, sustained, large-scope thinking the book teaches, is what 65 years of readers have called its magic. Before you go, do one specific thing. Identify the single most important area of your life where you are currently aiming at what feels safely achievable rather than what genuinely excites you. Write down what you would attempt in that area if you were certain you would not fail. Not as a commitment, just as information about what is genuinely there when the fear of failure is temporarily set aside. Then ask yourself what the first, smallest, most immediately available step toward that thing would look like. Not the whole thing, just the first step, and decide whether you are willing to take that step, knowing that it will be imperfect and that you will have to figure out the next step after you've taken it. The magic is not in the thinking. The magic is in what the thinking makes you willing to do. Thanks for watching all the way through. Your thinking is already bigger than your actions have shown. The interesting question is what changes when you close that gap. Let me go considerably deeper into several dimensions of the book that deserve more careful treatment than a first pass allows, because the surface of this book is simpler than its substance, and the substance is where the lasting value lives. The book's treatment of what Schwartz calls the poverty of small thinking deserves more careful examination, because it is making a specific claim about the relationship between mental habit and material outcome that is less obvious than it sounds on first encounter. The claim is not that positive thinking produces positive outcomes through some direct metaphysical mechanism. The claim is more mundane and more interesting, that how you habitually think about your situation determines the range of actions you consider worth taking, and that the range of actions you consider worth taking is the primary determinant of what you actually attempt, and what you actually attempt is the primary determinant of what you actually achieve. The chain is habitual thinking scope, therefore action scope, therefore outcome scope. The thinking doesn't directly produce the outcome. It indirectly produces it by determining what actions are even on the table. This is a mechanistic claim that is consistent with a wide range of empirical findings in psychology, from self-efficacy research to behavioral economics to the study of goal setting. People who believe larger outcomes are available to them attempt more things, persist longer in the face of difficulty, interpret obstacles as navigable rather than terminal, and invest more fully in what they're doing, all of which produce larger outcomes than the inverse of each of these behaviors produces. The self-limiting belief and the limited outcome are causally related, and the causal mechanism is the behavior that falls between them. Understanding this mechanism is important because it reveals what changing your outcomes actually requires. It does not require changing your circumstances first, though changed circumstances can help. It requires changing the habitual scope of what you believe is worth attempting, which changes the behavior that is worth engaging in, which changes the outcomes that are possible. And changing a habitual thinking scope is within the reach of virtually anyone who is willing to apply the specific, deliberate, repeated practices the book describes. Let me also spend more time on the specific mechanics of what Schwartz calls enthusiasm, which he treats as a learnable skill rather than a personality trait. Enthusiasm, in his framework, is not a feeling that either happens to you or doesn't. It is a deliberately cultivated state produced by specific, trainable mental practices. The primary practice is what he calls the deep conviction that what you are doing genuinely matters, that the specific work in front of you serves a real purpose that extends beyond the transaction itself. People who have developed this conviction about their work, who genuinely believe that what they are doing contributes to something meaningful rather than simply completing a task or earning a paycheck, perform consistently better, relate more authentically to the people they work with, and sustain engagement over longer periods than people who have not. The practical implication is to spend time deliberately identifying and articulating the larger purpose served by what you do, not in a rote or performative way, but through genuine reflection about who benefits from your work being done well. What would be worse for the world if you were not doing it? And what specifically you bring to it that makes the contribution real rather than replaceable. This reflection, done seriously, almost always reveals a larger purpose than the day-to-day transaction suggests, and the ongoing awareness of this purpose is what sustains enthusiasm in the way that the transaction alone never can. The second practice for building enthusiasm is what Schwartz calls the daily injection of optimism, a deliberate morning ritual, however brief, of orienting your attention toward what is possible and what is good before engaging with the inevitable stream of problems, frustrations, and demands that any significant day of work contains. This is not denial of difficulty. It is a deliberate sequencing choice. Establishing an optimistic orientation before the day's friction has a chance to establish a pessimistic one, so that the default lens through which the day is experienced is possibility-oriented rather than problem-oriented. The third practice is speaking about your work, your plans, and your prospects with genuine energy rather than with the protective pessimism that many people adopt to guard against disappointment. Schwartz observed that people who habitually spoke about what they were doing with genuine enthusiasm, who communicated genuine belief in what they were attempting, consistently attracted more help, more connection, more opportunity, and more favorable treatment than people who communicated with the cautious, self-protective understatement that small thinking produces. This is partly because enthusiasm is genuinely contagious in social contexts, and partly because people naturally prefer to associate with, invest in, and support people who believe in what they're doing. Let's talk about something the book covers in considerable depth: the management of your mental environment at the level of thought by thought, moment by moment. Schwartz distinguishes carefully between what he calls constructive thoughts and destructive thoughts, not in a moralistic sense but in a mechanistic one. Constructive thoughts are thoughts that produce useful energy, productive planning, genuine learning, effective problem solving, and the orientation toward possibility. Destructive thoughts are thoughts that drain energy, block productive planning, prevent genuine learning, create paralysis in the face of problems, and produce the orientation toward limitation. The specific thought patterns he identifies as most destructive are self-deprecating comparisons. I am less capable, less prepared, less worthy than the people I'm comparing myself to. Retrospective regret, obsessive revisiting of past mistakes and missed opportunities without productive learning. Prophylactic pessimism, the habitual assumption that things will go wrong, framed as realistic preparation but functioning as self-fulfilling discouragement. And the constant mental rehearsal of what might go wrong rather than of what might go right. The specific thought patterns he identifies as most constructive are deliberate attention to what is working and why, building on genuine strengths rather than fixating on limitations. Forward-facing planning, spending mental energy on what can be done from here rather than on what should have been done before. Mental rehearsal of success in specific, concrete terms, imagining the successful version of a meeting, a presentation, a difficult conversation with enough detail to produce genuine preparedness, and the practice of asking constructive questions rather than making defeatist statements, not, I can't do this, but how could I learn to do this? Not this will probably fail, but what would have to be true for this to succeed? This framework is consistent with what cognitive behavioral therapy has established about the relationship between thought patterns and outcomes. That habitual negative thought patterns produce genuine functional impairment independently of the external circumstances they're responding to, and that deliberately replacing them with more constructive alternatives is an effective intervention with measurable effects on performance, mood, and the quality of decisions people make. Let me also discuss something that the book addresses explicitly and that I think is underemphasized in most treatments of its content: the management of the psychological experience of setting and pursuing a significantly larger goal than you have previously attempted. Schwartz is honest about the fact that large goals produce large anxiety. The stretch of genuinely ambitious ambition is accompanied by a kind of psychological exposure that modest ambition avoids. You are more visible, the potential failure is more public, the investment is larger, the stakes feel higher, and the distance between where you are and where you want to be is more obvious. For many people, this exposure is the primary deterrent to large-scope thinking. The problem is not that they don't know what they want or lack the capacity to pursue it, but that the process of pursuing it feels more psychologically threatening than the comfortable continuation of what they currently have. Schwartz's response to this is both practical and honest. He doesn't promise that the anxiety of ambitious pursuit goes away. He argues that it diminishes through the accumulation of experience with it. Each time you take a significant action in spite of the anxiety associated with actions of that kind decreases slightly, because you now have evidence that the action was survivable and often productive. The confidence account he describes earlier is built precisely through this process. The deposit made by taking an action you were afraid to take is not just the external result of the action, but the internal evidence it produces that you can do this kind of thing, which reduces the fear associated with the next similar action. He also makes the practical observation that most of the specific fears associated with ambitious pursuit, when examined concretely, are considerably less threatening than the vague anxiety surrounding them suggests. The fear of public failure, examined specifically, often reveals that the actual consequences of a specific failure are far more manageable than the fear predicts. The fear of not being good enough, examined specifically, often reveals that the gap between your current capability and the capability required is bridgeable through effort rather than unbridgeable by nature. This practice of examining vague fears concretely, of converting "this might go terribly wrong" into, specifically, "what might go wrong and how bad would that actually be," is one of the most effective anxiety management tools available, and one that Schwartz returns to throughout the book. Now let me address something the book touches on only briefly, but that deserves more direct treatment in a contemporary context: the relationship between thinking big and the people who are closest to you. Ambitious thinking and ambitious action have effects on the relationships in your life that are not always positive or simple, and honest engagement with this material requires acknowledging that. When you begin to think and act at a larger scope than you previously have, some of the people around you will be supportive, some will be neutral, and some will, without necessarily meaning to, actively work against the expansion you're attempting. This isn't primarily malice. It's the well-documented phenomenon of people responding to change in those around them in ways that protect the equilibrium of the relationship. Because change in one person necessarily changes the relationship itself. The person who begins seriously pursuing a significant goal often finds that friends who seemed supportive in the abstract become subtly discouraging in the specific, that family members who would celebrate success in the eventual future create friction in the early stages of pursuit, and that some established relationships gradually become less central as new ones form around the direction you're moving in. Schwartz's advice in this area is consistent with the rest of the book. Manage your environment deliberately. Seek out people who are genuinely supportive of your expansion, rather than depending primarily on people who are invested in the status quo. And do this not as a rejection of existing relationships, but as a necessary addition to them. You do not need to abandon the people who love you as you currently are. You do need to actively build relationships with people who can support you as you're becoming. Let's also spend some time on what the book has to say about the specific practice of decision-making, because this is an area where large thinking has concrete, immediate applications. Small thinkers, Schwartz observes, are frequently paralyzed by decisions, particularly decisions that carry any significant risk of being wrong. They gather more information than the decision requires, consult more people than the decision warrants, delay longer than the situation allows, and ultimately make the decision with less confidence than a timely choice would have produced, because the delay itself has become a drain on the confidence account rather than a source of additional certainty. Large thinkers make decisions more quickly not because they are less thoughtful, but because they have developed a different relationship with the uncertainty that decisions carry. They have accepted, at a practical level, that decisions in conditions of genuine uncertainty are never final, that course correction is always possible, and that the cost of a timely, imperfect decision is almost always lower than the cost of a delayed one. They have also developed the specific habit of asking, "What is the worst realistic outcome if I decide wrong?" And they have found repeatedly that the honest answer to this question is considerably less threatening than the vague anxiety of the undecided state. The practical prescription is to develop what might be called a decision hygiene practice. For any significant decision, give yourself a specific, bounded amount of time to gather relevant information, identify the key factors, consult the people whose judgment you most trust, and then decide, accepting that the decision is good given the information available rather than waiting for certainty that will not come. Finally, before we move to the practical close, let me note something about this book that distinguishes it from the many books that have since occupied the same territory. Schwartz wrote at a time before the personal development industry existed as the enormous enterprise it subsequently became, and the magic of thinking big has none of the stylistic features that many later books in the genre developed to compensate for relatively thin content. There is no dramatic personal story in the opening, no celebrity testimonials woven through, no proprietary framework with a four-letter acronym, no companion workbook or premium course to sell. What it has instead is the specific, observed, practical wisdom of someone who spent decades watching what actually worked in the lives of real people trying to build real things, and who had the clarity of thought and the honesty to write it down as directly and as usefully as he could. This directness, more than 60 years old, still reads as fresh, because the patterns it describes are genuinely timeless. The size of what people think they deserve and what they permit themselves to attempt has been the primary determinant of what they achieve for as long as people have been achieving things, and that will not change. Here is what tonight can look like. Take 5 minutes and write honest answers to these 3 questions, not the answers you'd give in public, but the honest ones. First, what is the most significant thing you would attempt in the next 2 years if you genuinely believed you could succeed at it? Second, what specific excuse have you been using most reliably and most habitually to justify not attempting it? Third, what is the smallest, most immediately available action you could take in the next 48 hours that would represent the beginning of an attempt? The answers to those 3 questions, taken together, are your personal version of the thinking big prescription. The first tells you where you want to go. The second tells you what's been in the way. The third tells you how to begin. Not tomorrow, not when conditions are better, not when you feel more ready. Now with what you have from where you are. That is the magic. Thanks for watching all the way through. The size of your thinking is the only ceiling in this room, and it turns out that ceiling moves.